A nuclear-powered Russian nuclear submarine which sank in 1989 off the Norwegian coast is leaking high levels of radiation into the sea.
It looks peaceful off Russia's eastern shore, but beneath that calm surface rests a nightmare from the Cold War. Submarines armed with nuclear cores lie broken, leaking, and forgotten.
A Soviet submarine that sank off Norway in 1989 is emitting high levels of radiation.
Scientists believe the danger had passed long ago, until new evidence proved otherwise. What they've uncovered could change how the world sees the past. You won't believe what's still hiding under those waves, and why experts are now calling it one of the worst discoveries yet. The submarine graveyard. In the frozen waters north of Russia lies a silent danger, one that time has only made worse. Beneath the surface, the remains of discarded Soviet nuclear submarines rest on the ocean floor, with many still holding their radioactive cores. Few realize how close these relics are to unleashing what could be one of the most serious environmental disasters in Arctic history. But how did they end up here, and why were they left behind? During the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union built one of the largest nuclear submarine fleets the world had ever seen. These vessels were symbols of power which were created to patrol distant oceans and rival the United States in strength. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Navy controlled hundreds of submarines of different types. This included attack subs and massive Typhoon class, which were over 570 feet and carried 20 nuclear missiles. Such a vast fleet demanded constant attention, maintenance, and new constructions, all running at once. But the faster they built, the sooner old submarines began piling up. The question became unavoidable. Where would all these steel giants go once their service ended? In the Soviet Pacific Fleet's main base at Vladivostok, the problem became painfully visible. The bays that once launched nuclear subs into open water turned into floating graveyards. Locals began to call it the submarine cemetery. Rusting hulls sat in clusters near the shore, some stripped of parts. Others were left almost untouched with their reactors still sealed within. The sight was both fascinating and alarming. Decommissioning them was no simple task. Removing nuclear fuel safely and disposing of contaminated materials required time, technology, and money. The Soviet system had procedures for this, but the numbers were overwhelming, and as the Soviet Union neared collapse, the system began to break down. Resources were thin, and environmental concerns took a back seat to economic survival. The nation found itself responsible for hundreds of nuclear submarines. Many were already aging with their reactor compartments dangerously unstable. Without proper dismantling, they were left where they sank or docked. Today, many of those reactor compartments still rest beneath the surface, and their protective barriers weaken with each passing year. The Arctic's cold waters slow corrosion, but they do not stop it. Experts fear that one day seawater will reach the uranium still sealed inside, triggering an uncontrolled release of radiation into one of the world's most fragile environments. The question now is not if this will happen, but when. The Chajma Bay explosion. What lay beneath the waves was only part of the danger. Near the same waters where abandoned submarines rusted away, another disaster had already shown just how deadly a single mistake could be. It began as a routine refueling operation in August 1985. However, it spiraled into one of the worst nuclear accidents in the history of the Soviet Navy. The submarine involved was docked at the Pacific Fleet's base near Vladivostok, where engineers had gathered to replace the reactor's fuel assemblies. Refueling a nuclear submarine had always carried enormous risk, but on that day, a series of human errors and technical miscalculations set off a disaster that no one could control. Reports later revealed that while the process was underway, an uncontrolled chain reaction began inside the reactor compartment. Within seconds, a violent explosion tore through the vessel. The blast was so powerful, it blew the reactor lid high into the air. 10 people were killed instantly. Dozens more were severely burned or exposed to radiation as they rushed to help. Those who witnessed it described it as a chaos unlike any they had ever seen. The explosion showered the shipyard with fragments of metal and radioactive material. A fire soon followed, and it burned for hours before it could be brought under control. By the time it was contained, much of the dockyard was covered in contamination. Soviet authorities immediately sealed off the site. Armed guards surrounded the area, roads were blocked, and information was silenced. Families of the dead were told little. Within hours, Chajma Bay was locked down under strict military secrecy. For years, the full extent of what happened remained hidden from the public. Only after the Soviet Union's collapse did reports begin to surface, and it revealed how far the contamination had spread. Soil and water samples taken after the blast confirmed the worst fears. Radioactive isotopes were found across the bay's shoreline and seabed. Even today, traces of radiation can still be detected in certain parts of Chajma Bay. Experts say the disaster at Chajma Bay was not an isolated event. It exposed the flaws in Soviet-era safety practices and the enormous risks tied to maintaining such a vast nuclear fleet. Many of the submarines decommissioned after the Cold War were left in temporary storage sites that were never fully dismantled. Engineers once believed these locations would be cleared within a few years. Instead, decades passed, leaving corroding reactor compartments scattered across the seabed. Retrieving these forgotten reactors is a complex and dangerous task. It requires specialized tools and trained teams capable of handling radioactive components safely. News outlets have described the region as an environmental disaster waiting to happen, and it's for good reason. The Arctic and Pacific waters that once supported the Soviet fleet now conceal potential nuclear hazards. What happens if these decaying reactors give way? How long can time hold back the damage? Shadows of Vladivostok. Something about that explosion changed everything. After the blast at Chajma Bay in 1985, the Soviet Pacific Fleet was forced to face a harsh truth. The accident was not just a local disaster, it exposed how fragile submarine maintenance truly was. Engineers and commanders saw how easily a small oversight could grow into something that threatened both lives and land. That explosion left behind more than wreckage. It sent shockwaves through naval operations across the region. Those who worked near submarine reactors began to understand that even a minor miscalculation could have lasting consequences. Facilities near Vladivostok were especially vulnerable as they were built during a time when safety standards were far less advanced. But what made Chajma Bay truly frightening was not the explosion itself. It was what came after. Unlike oil spills or chemical leaks, radiation does not fade easily. It settles into soil and sand, seeps into marine life, and stays there for generations. And as mentioned before, traces of that contamination remain. This single event changed how experts view the decaying submarines now left along Russia's coast. Many of those hulks sit close to where the explosion occurred, and though they no longer serve any purpose, the risk they carry is undeniable. What would happen if one of those old reactor compartments began to break apart? Could another Chajma Bay occur, only this time under the sea? Naval historians still point to that day as the turning point. It stands as evidence that even after decades, the dangers of nuclear power at sea never fully disappear. Every conversation about dismantling submarines or storing their reactors circles back to that one accident. Chajma Bay remains a warning from the past, echoing through every new decision made near Vladivostok's cold waters. Fallout of a broken empire. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia did not just inherit land, people, or power. It also inherited a fleet of nuclear submarines that had become both its pride and its burden. By the early 1990s, hundreds of these once feared machines floated in silence. Their missions were long over, but their dangers were far from gone. Many of them still carried nuclear reactors, some with spent fuel still inside. The new Russian Federation simply did not have the money or the means to handle what came next. The numbers were overwhelming. Reports at the time estimated that more than 180 nuclear submarines required dismantling. Each one held a reactor built to last through the Cold War, not to sit idle and decay. The process of safely taking them apart was far more complicated than anyone expected. Defueling alone was a monumental task that required advanced equipment, trained technicians, and secure facilities. For many submarines, that step never came soon enough. They were left moored at piers or anchored in remote bays with their reactors still active. Shipyard workers spoke of vessels left half-cut open, waiting for orders or money that never arrived. Some submarines had their valuable parts stripped away and were then abandoned, still radioactive, their hulls rusting under snow and salt. It was not just a technical issue, it was a growing environmental threat. By the mid-90s, the problem had become too large to hide. Environmental organizations such as Greenpeace and the Bologna Foundation began investigating. Their reports showed haunting images of broken submarines scattered along Russia's northern and Pacific coasts. Some lay in shallow waters, others dumped outright. Conning towers poked through the surface like monuments of a forgotten era, their steel frames slowly corroding in the cold sea air. These findings caused international concern. The world realized that the danger from the old Soviet nuclear fleet had not disappeared with the Cold War. It was still there, rusting away, and more importantly, it was threatening another kind of disaster. Western governments began to act. In the late 1990s, cooperation programs were launched to help Russia manage the crisis. The United States, Japan, Norway, and several other nations offered funding, equipment, and technical guidance through efforts like the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. This foreign assistance brought visible progress. Dozens of submarines were finally defueled and dismantled. Reactor compartments were cut out and sealed. Yet even with international help, the pace was painfully slow. It could take more than a year to dismantle a single vessel, while hundreds still waited. Each project required heavy cranes, dry docks, and protective shielding. These were resources that were scarce across Russian shipyards, still recovering from economic collapse. Even after the reactors were removed, there was still the question of where to put them. Russia began stacking massive reactor compartments in open-air storage sites, each one weighing hundreds of tons. From a distance, they looked like rows of metal cylinders sitting silently on frozen ground. These sites were meant to reduce immediate danger, but they also created new challenges. Even defueled, those reactors remained radioactive, and due to this, they required constant monitoring and containment to prevent future contamination. The world's attention eventually shifted, but the problem never fully went away. Some experts believe that without continued maintenance, the stored reactor sections could once again pose risks in the coming decades. The Soviet Union may have ended in 1991, but its nuclear legacy still lingers along Russia's coasts, waiting quietly in the cold. The ghosts beneath Vladivostok. In the Russian Far East, where Vladivostok serves as the Pacific Fleet's base, distance and money became powerful obstacles. Transporting heavy reactor sections across thousands of miles to central storage sites proved almost impossible. Even as the economy improved in the 2000s, attention shifted to building new weapons rather than dismantling the old ones. Each delay in funding pushed cleanup further into the future, leaving nearby communities uncertain about the dangers surrounding them. Walk through one of the storage yards today, and you will find rows of reactor compartments arranged like tombs. Each one was once part of a submarine that roamed the Pacific. Now, stripped of their power and left in the open, they sit exposed to wind, rain, and snow. Some submarines still float offshore, waiting for dismantlement that may never come. Others exist only in faded documents, their true condition unknown. Experts say that in several cases, no one can confirm whether these submarines were ever defueled or safely neutralized. So how serious is the risk? Reports suggest that some reactor sections contain damaged fuel rods, making them far more unstable. Environmental investigators have long warned that exposure to storms and corrosion could lead to leakage. If a single reactor compartment were to rupture, radioactive materials could flow directly into the surrounding bays. And as you know by now, this would not just contaminate the water. It would also threaten fisheries and marine life that local economies depend on. The Vladivostok site stands out because of the sheer number of vessels concentrated in one place. Satellite images and naval records show entire lines of decommissioned submarines resting side by side, with many of them already corroded. Unlike secure facilities where radiation levels are carefully monitored, these hulks sit in open water, slowly wearing away. It raises the question, what happens when the sea itself begins to eat through steel once meant to withstand the depths? Even more troubling are the gaps in documentation. During recent mapping projects, researchers discovered submarines that were not even listed in official records. Their existence was confirmed only when teams physically located them. The realization that some nuclear reactors were effectively lost in bureaucracy shocked observers worldwide. As one expert put it, in nuclear safety, even one missing reactor is too many. Years of effort and foreign assistance have improved some conditions, but the broader problem remains unresolved. The truth is simple, yet unsettling, and it is that building a nuclear fleet is far easier than safely retiring it. What lies beneath the bay? When reports first emerged about the submarine graveyard off Vladivostok, it sent ripples far beyond the Pacific coast. The site became impossible to ignore once data confirmed what many locals had suspected. Radiation teams were quickly deployed to the coastline, establishing checkpoints near fishing villages and ports. Their initial readings were not immediately disastrous, but they showed something officials could not downplay, and this was elevated radiation levels in the sediment and seawater. Officials tried to contain the panic by choosing their words carefully. They reassured residents that there was no urgent danger. Yet, they quietly admitted that the risk from long-term exposure could not be dismissed. This silence did not last long. Environmental organizations began conducting their own tests, collecting samples from the same waters that sustained the region's fishing industry. Their findings mirrored the government's data, but carried a tone that struck harder. Contamination was no longer an abstract threat. It was already in contact with the people. Fishermen started to worry about their catch, and for good reason. Traces of radioactive material were detected in seafood samples, which made many wonder about how deep the contamination might run. If one site was leaking, what about the others scattered along Russia's Pacific coast? The concern quickly grew from a local issue to a national embarrassment. International experts soon, once again, joined the discussion. They noted that previous cleanup efforts in similar regions had only succeeded because of joint funding and foreign assistance. Without those partnerships, dismantling and securing reactor compartments could take decades. And this would leave vulnerable communities to face the risk alone. In Moscow, the response was mixed. Some politicians dismissed the findings as exaggerated. They called the reports an attempt to stir unnecessary panic. Others inside the government acknowledged what many already knew, and this was the fact that inaction would eventually cost far more than the cleanup itself. Every month of delay meant more corrosion, more exposure, and a greater chance that one of those forgotten submarines could fail. As the debate carried on, the people living near Vladivostok continued to fish, work, and breathe beside waters that might never truly be safe again. And somewhere beneath the surface, the metal hulls of the Cold War kept decaying, releasing a quiet warning that refuses to fade. More trouble beneath the surface. The news from Vladivostok spread faster than anyone expected. What began as quiet concern inside local offices soon became a national conversation that Moscow could no longer ignore. Beneath the surface of the bay, the Cold War's forgotten machines were corroding, and with them came a growing fear that the damage might already be reaching the people who lived nearby. Behind closed doors, ministers in Moscow debated what to do. Some feared that admitting the full danger could weaken Russia's future energy deals abroad. Others insisted that denying the scale of the problem would only make things worse. In the Far East, local leaders were losing patience. They demanded help from the federal government, warning that delay would not only endanger lives, but also cripple the fishing industry that fed and employed thousands of families. The situation placed the authorities in a difficult position. Before long, international pressure grew. Experts from nearby nations asked to see the full radiation data to assess if the contamination might spread beyond Russian waters. The official response came quickly, but raised more doubts than answers. Government agencies released partial figures while withholding specific information about the location of reactor assemblies and spent material. That selective disclosure created suspicion both inside and outside Russia. Environmental organizations and foreign observers warned that time was running out. They pointed out that removing reactor compartments from submarines usually takes years of steady work and funding, and any pause in the process meant more decay, more leaks, and more danger. Insiders later confirmed that talks to speed up cleanup were already underway, but money and coordination were still uncertain. Local communities found themselves trapped in the middle, as they were aware of the threat, yet unsure if help would ever come. Within weeks, the issue grew beyond regional headlines. Activists organized public appeals, calling on the government to publish full survey maps of the contaminated sites. Meanwhile, state-controlled media acknowledged the discovery, but softened the details, describing the event as manageable. This contrast only deepened mistrust and pushed more citizens to seek answers on their own. By the time independent experts spoke publicly, one fact was undeniable. The problem beneath Vladivostok's waters was not fading, it was growing, and the longer it remained unsolved, the greater the risk for everyone living along Russia's Pacific coast. Whether politics, funding, and cooperation could match the scale of the crisis was a question waiting for an honest answer. A deadly countdown begins. The danger is not limited to Vladivostok anymore. Similar sites for submarine disposal stretch far beyond, scattered along coasts and in the Arctic seas. Each wreck carries its own silent risk. Among them lies the K-27. This experimental November-class submarine carried 2 liquid metal-cooled reactors, a daring but deadly design. In 1968, while still at sea, one of those reactors failed. A leak and partial meltdown released intense radiation that killed 9 sailors and left 83 others gravely ill. The K-27 managed to return to port, but no effort could truly save it. Years of testing and failed attempts led to a grim decision. In 1981, Tugboats hauled the submarine to the Kara Sea and sent it to the bottom, reactors, fuel, and all. Experts have long warned that nuclear material should be sunk no shallower than about 1,800 miles deep. The K-27 rests at barely 160 feet. When Norwegian and Russian teams inspected the wreck in 2012, they found it mostly intact, but that discovery came with a chilling prediction. Naval engineers believe it may hold only until around 2032 before corrosion finally wins. And the K-27 is not alone. Another relic, the K-159, poses an even greater danger. It too belonged to the November class and suffered a radiation leak as early as 1965. Despite that, it stayed in service until 1989, before being abandoned in storage for 14 long years. Then, in 2003, tragedy struck again. A fierce storm ripped the submarine from its pontoons during transport. It sank to the bottom of the Barents Sea, dragging 9 crew members with it. Today it lies roughly 800 feet down, and experts fear its unsealed reactors are slowly leaking into the ocean. Russia has acknowledged the threat. Plans have been announced to recover the K-27, the K-159, and 4 other dangerous reactor compartments scattered across the Arctic. As of March 2020, the cost of this recovery effort was estimated at about $330 million. But the challenge is enormous. The K-159 is to be the first lifted, yet the specialized recovery ship required for the task does not even exist. Its design and construction were set to begin in 2021 and be completed by the end of 2026. Time, however, is not on anyone's side. The sea continues its slow, unrelenting work, eating away at steel, sealing in decay while hiding danger. If the effort to raise these subs fails or comes too late, the consequences could rival another Chernobyl. However, this time, it would be underwater. The race to prevent that nightmare has already begun. Race to prevent a radioactive disaster. Even with plans in motion, a new wave of concern is growing. Scientists warn that raising the wrecks would only solve a fraction of the problem. From the Arctic to the Pacific, more than 100 nuclear remnants were still unaccounted for. The sea had swallowed them long ago, and the threat inside them never faded. The first and most urgent task, according to technical records, is to remove the remaining nuclear fuel from any submarine or reactor compartment still holding assemblies. This task is neither simple nor cheap. It demands special facilities, trained personnel, and secure transport routes. Without these, one mistake could release radiation into the surrounding waters if a corroded compartment collapses. It is a technical race against time, one that requires precision and transparency in every move. Yet, even if defueling succeeds, the next step is equally critical, and this involves finding safe long-term storage. Moving waste from one bay to another has never solved the problem. The real solution lies in isolating these reactor compartments in purpose-built facilities that can contain radiation for generations. In the past, temporary storage solutions were used as stopgaps, but those measures only pushed the danger further down the line. Each delay increases the chance that aging containers could fail before permanent options are ready. Yet even if those facilities are built, the problem of trust remains. Over the years, official reports have been met with doubt. Independent inspections by international organizations and non-governmental groups have repeatedly found gaps in data and instances where vital information was withheld. In some cases, delayed reporting prevented an effective response to rising radiation levels. Without transparent monitoring and open access to radiation data, local communities will continue to question every assurance they hear. So, how can confidence be rebuilt if information remains locked away? Many believe the answer lies in international cooperation. History has already shown that cleanup projects in the Arctic were only possible through joint funding and foreign technology. The scale of Vladivostok's challenge is far beyond what local resources can manage alone. Experts argue that this is not about charity, but about mutual protection. The Pacific Ocean connects countries, and its currents do not respect borders. If contamination spreads, the impact will reach far beyond Russian waters. This is why watchdog groups are now calling for a firm timeline. They propose 3 key targets. First is the complete removal of still-fueled compartments within the next 10 years. Next is the establishment of permanent storage facilities within 20. And lastly is the continuous public radiation monitoring at every stage. Anything less, they warn, would risk turning an already fragile situation into a full-scale regional crisis. Meanwhile, pressure is mounting. Local communities are demanding answers. Neighboring countries are asking for clarity. Environmental organizations are amplifying their campaigns. Experts keep repeating the same warning. They say waiting too long could make recovery impossible. Once corrosion reaches a certain level, no amount of funding can reverse the damage. The cost of inaction is not measured in money alone, but in safety, credibility, and human health. The path forward is no mystery. Defueling, secured storage, transparent monitoring, and renewed cooperation must all happen without delay. These steps are not optional. They are the only way to prevent the waters near Vladivostok from becoming a global environmental threat. What happens next will decide whether this crisis ends in control or catastrophe. If you want to follow what happens next, hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.